and welcome to the Geek Legion of Doom. We are going to be talking TV. Now, the reason I'm making this video is the new season of The Walking Dead is about to drop later on this month, I believe. And to be honest, the previous season, it was quite hard to watch. And I was like, can I be bothered to watch this final season? And it made me think of examples of where I have watched a TV show and given up. So I've decided to do a kind of a list, a top 10 list, if you will, of TV shows where I've given up on them and where I've set myself a couple of rules. And this has been where I've watched the TV shows whilst they've been on TV, not kind of watching them on kind of DVD or anything like this. So this is whilst they are being kind of broadcast. So I have given up on, whilst they are still kind of being aired. And the second thing is I've had to have watched at least one full season of the show. So there are certain shows where I've watched a couple of episodes, decided it's not for me. The Expanse, for example. But I won't count that because I didn't have enough of a kind of experience, so to speak, to kind of really say I was invested in it. So these are top 10 shows, or at least 10 shows, where I have, watched at least one season and have watched them whilst they are aired. It's also worth noting they're more modern because TV shows, whilst they were kind of being broadcast in the past in the UK, especially if they were from the States, weren't always kind of broadcast in order, and they're a little bit kind of spotty on where they were kind of like broadcast. So some of the times you would just end up not watching something because it just stopped broadcasting. So these are kind of more modern shows. So let's get started. And they're not really in any specific order, to be honest with you. But we're going to talk about it. And there's a theme with some of them. So the first one is Supergirl. And this was this is a show that changed network from one network to another in the States, but was part of the Arrowverse, so to speak, of the DC. The reason why I kind of watched this one is that to me it lent too heavily into political ideas, identity politics and things like that. And I like to try and keep my entertainment somewhat kind of, free from political ideology one way or the other. Now, I don't mind sometimes it's relevant, but this, I felt it was kind of somewhat forced in, and it really I found it quite preachy. And I didn't really like that. And if it's kind of in an organic way, or if the subject is about a political matter, then fair enough. But if the subject is Supergirl, and it's very much, it's kind of wearing its kind of its political ideologies as its kind of like main forefront, it kind of turned me off of the show, to be honest with you. So I stopped watching that one. The next one is Westworld. This was a show where I watched the first 2 seasons, and I started to lose interest in the second season whilst I was watching that, and I just felt it was a little bit kind of like a bit of a hard pill to swallow. It wasn't particularly interesting, and it was a little bit up its own arse, to be quite honest. I enjoyed the original Westworld movie, and I felt they were trying to kind of stretch the story out a little bit too kind of thinly, and it really wasn't going anywhere, so I didn't bother watching the 3rd season. So I ended up only watching the first 2. Next one is the DC Legends of Tomorrow. This is a show where I quite enjoyed it initially, with a kind of like a kind of rogue band of heroes, but it ended up getting quite kind of silly. And I don't mind sort of comedy shows, so to speak, but the kind of the tone of the show ended up being like a spoof with cartoon characters. Now, I know ironically this is based on comic characters, but I felt the first few seasons, the first maybe 2 or 3 seasons, treated the characters reasonably seriously, as much as kind of like TV show, superhero series do. So you can kind of still buy into them as real people, kind of real characters. But as the show got sort of, further into its kind of run, it just, the concepts were sillier, the characters were way over the top and kind of not really like any real people's sort of types of personalities. So I kind of gave up on it. Number 7 was The Flash. Now, out of all of the kind of the DC sort of CW shows, this is the one that I think I enjoyed the most. And to be honest with you, this was partly down to the pandemic. I think there was just such this kind of stopped halfway through a season, I believe. And I just kind of like fell out of it, if that makes sense. And when it kind of restarted, I sort of tried to watch the next episode, and I just thought it's kind of silly. It's just it's still a little bit silly for me, and I couldn't really remember what had happened. So I just kind of like, well, I'll give up on it. So that was kind of the reason. So that was kind of partially through the pandemic reasons, but I just kind of like restarted to watch it, and where it kind of had left off was just, it was very kind of silly. And by that time we had kind of, you know, I'd watched things like The Boys, and was a little bit more interested in kind of the more grittier kind of style, kind of superhero shows. The next one we're going to talk about is Black Summer. Now, this was a TV show developed by the Asylum, the film company, and this was a kind of spin-off of Z Nation, a series which I didn't watch because it was too silly. But Black Summer was a bit more of a serious take on the zombie genre, and I watched the first season and kind of really enjoyed it because it had a much more of a violent, grittier, and frenetic kind of pace to it. But I watched the first episode of the second season, and again, somewhat down to the pandemic because it had been a while. I think the last season was in like 2019. But the kind of the style of the show, it's just like very unlikable characters, and the way it's kind of shot, it's kind of non-linear. So you're kind of seeing different things from different kind of perspectives, and I didn't really feel it give you a kind of chance to catch up. And it's really just showing you the kind of the very worst of humanity all the time. It's one of the kind of the criticisms that got levied at The Walking Dead. It was just kind of negative all the time, and you need a kind of bit more of a balanced mix. But here, every sort of character is very selfish and out for themselves. So I gave it the one episode. I just thought, no, it's not really. I just couldn't be bothered to watch anymore. The next one is Arrow. So yes, it's pretty much all of these kind of DC shows I've given up on. And there was a point in Arrow where they kind of did a jump forward into the future. And at that point, I kind of lost interest because I just thought, well, you're kind of like, you know, if this is in the future, we know everything that happens in the past is irrelevant, so to speak. And it introduced a kind of a bunch of new characters, I think, to try and have a spin-off. But it just felt very kind of low budget, very, very TV, and was, again, just a little bit sillier, so I kind of gave up on it. The next one is The 100, which is a kind of again, it's a CW show in the States, and that's who produced it. And it's kind of a young adult style science fiction, along the kind of the lines of The Maze Runner, The Hunger Games, that sort of thing. And initially it was quite interesting about these colonies that have been living in space for, you know, a long time, and they come back down to Earth, and it was quite good for the first few seasons. But I just felt it kind of got dragged along a little bit too long. I just think it kind of like our kind of central characters seem to get into all the kind of the main adventures that were kind of like, oh, this is going to destroy the planet. I just think these things always happening to these same sort of characters. It just felt it was kind of repeating itself a little bit too much. So I think that should have stopped at a certain point. So I gave it up. The next one is Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. And I'm a huge Marvel fan. You know, I really do enjoy the kind of the Marvel product. But this is a show I watched right up until the last season. And at that point, I kind of gave up on it. Because to me, Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. went above its station. It was having like world-defining kind of adventures. And to me, this is kind of a TV show that should be about the kind of the smaller sort of stuff that's going on. And the larger kind of storylines should be reserved for the films. I just got it a little bit, again, I thought it was a little bit silly. It kind of annoyed me that the character of Daisy Johnson seemed to be pivotal to every single mission that they ever went on. And I always felt like, you needed to have a bit more of a balance on the characters and stuff. And it was just very, very kind of TV. And I know some people do like that show, but to me, I just couldn't be bothered with it anymore. After I think I didn't bother watching any of the last season, but I kind of watched the previous season. I missed a few episodes. And I just can't be bothered with it anymore. The next one is actually a few shows, but I'm going to kind of put them into one, and that is the CSI series. So I used to watch all of the kind of the CSI, the original one, the New York one, and the Miami one. The Miami one was my favourite, which actually kind of got cancelled. So I did watch kind of all of those. But it was around the time that Ted Danson joined the cast, I think, of the sort of central show. I just kind of lost interest in it, to be honest. It was just a show that was kind of very much rinse and repeat. It was very episodic. There's a lot of through kind of storylines in there. And I like the characters best on the kind of the Miami show and then probably the New York show. But I kind of just sort of lost interest in the property as a whole and therefore kind of, gave the whole lot up, essentially. And the final one is the show that I think has been invested in the longest. And that was the X-Files. Now, I was a huge X-Files fan when this series originally came out. And I watched nearly all of the original series. Now, the last season of the original series where you didn't really have Scully or Mulder in it, I have to be honest with you, I only watched a few episodes because I kind of lost interest. Because I was so invested in the characters of Mulder and Scully, I wasn't really interested when they kind of got replaced with Robert Patrick and Annabella Gish. So I kind of stopped watching. I didn't watch all of those seasons. And then obviously they kind of did the later seasons that returned Mulder and Scully. And I watched one episode, and to me it had just been too long, and the magic had gone. And I just thought, I'm just not interested. This show now has been too long for me, and I can't be bothered to watch the kind of like more of the same of that. So I kind of didn't bother watching it anymore. So that is a top 10, and I'm sure there are others, but they're kind of my sort of top 10 that I could think of shows where I have given up, that I've watched at least one season of all of those shows that I've mentioned, but decided to stop watching for whatever reason. So I'm very, very curious if there are any shows out there that you guys have stopped watching and why you decided to stop watching them. I'd love to know. I mean, if you want to do a top 10 list, that's great. Or if you just want to say some individual ones, please do let me know. Anyway, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye for now.